how many of you are planning to sacrifice and buy your own house, invest? When anybody in on that? This is hard, right? It's hard for a lot of people right now. I'm not saying that you should. Shorter version of that sentence. Cheery, cheery. The future seems so hopelessly doomed. So that Maskovsky argues that there has been this end times talk and that we end up in this bunker mentality. Right. Because if you are generally well equipped to deal with a zombie apocalypse, you will be prepared. This is the CDC talking. You will be prepared for a hurricane, pandemic, earthquake, or terrorist attack. The thing was, this was in 2011, right? And so here they were telling us that if we prepared for this, we would be prepared for that. Then we actually had a fucking pandemic, and we obviously weren't prepared. In fact, the CDC wasn't prepared. They were terrible. I don't know if they're still terrible. The thing is they were obviously not on the right track here. I don't know what they were doing. Whatever it was, it sucked. We obviously were not prepared for a pandemic. We weren't prepared for anything. No. One of the funny things that also, this article was written before COVID, and so it would be interesting to rethink it. So for a long time, this didn't seem like it would ever happen. Mortgage rates were so low. And then they got even lower during COVID. They went down to and you could lock in. It was great. Like way low percentage rates. Now, if you check them, this is what's actually happening. Now it's like way high again. And so anybody that is in a mortgage doesn't want to change. You don't want to change. You don't want to move. You don't want to sell your house. And so if you don't want to move, then it affects the white collar people, but it also affects the blue collar people too, because there's no houses, because nobody will move. Nobody wants to change, and you can't get a mortgage anyway. So the funny thing is, nothing is funny. The weird thing is that I didn't think this would ever happen, but now it's happening. I'm seeing it play out where people are just like, nope, not going to change. And then you don't have housing, and the housing that you have is super expensive. So this kind of sucks. We'll come back to what you should do about this later on. Settler colonialism as a structure must feed off indigenous dispossession. Why is that written in the present tense? It's still going on. That's one of TallBear's points, as we saw back with Simpson on the Mohawk. It's still going on. It's still happening today. You had also this longer quote, which is not just about land, but representational appropriation. TallBear's most famous work is a book called Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science. And so I think what she's saying is, one, the whole idea that indigenous DNA can simply be extracted for science puts them more in the category of the other, the dead, the vanishing. And it is also a false promise in the terms of this idea of quantum membership is not really what determines membership in an indigenous community. It's more about tribal belonging, which is also interesting to reflect upon. If that's true, then what was happening in Simpson's article about the Mohawk and the kicking out people with less than 50% blood quantum is, again, weird. All right, so she asks, what if settlers had not been dead set on cultural evangelizing through governance, religion, and science? So there is a what if question there. Her point is, though, that it's partially a what if, but it's partially a response to what was actually going on at the time. There were other things actually happening in these settler communities, and she's talking about her own ancestors in the Dakotas, and there was a war and a massacre there. But it was also true that by 1862, Dakota and European descendants were already heavily entangled through marriage and family. And so she's talking here about the work of some historians and others who talk about how some of these tribal leaders were actually making kinship and alliances and forming these entanglements on what was the frontier. And that what the wars and the massacres were probably maybe coming in from the outside and were not part of this relationship. And this is again coming from an indigenous person. She says, I propose making kin as an alternative approach to liberal multiculturalism. And so what she seems to be saying is that if we are all going to be living together, that the way to do it, what might be a different way to do it, is through, as she puts it, calling non-Indigenous people into kin relations as a diplomatic strategy. And she admits here that this is, as she put it, a new and discomforting idea to me, even while it may be an idea that was once common among my ancestors. And so what she's saying is, she's like, I don't know, calling non-Indigenous people into kinship relationships, I'm discomforted by it, but I want to propose it. I want to maybe take that chance. And so I feel like I am coming to believe in my life that the issues of indigeneity and how we respond to that, both from the non-Indigenous and perhaps from the Indigenous perspective, can we establish these kinds of kinship relationships? Or is there going to be a further divide here? So are we going to confront the issue of indigeneity, or are we going to keep on with the settler colonialism point of view? Are we going to establish these relationships of kinship across these divides and community across these divides, or are we going to keep on with our allegiance to nation state and national forms of sovereignty? I'm not saying nationalism has to go away. I'm just saying with TallBear that there may be a different approach here, which is one based on real relations of kinship. If this is true, what is again interesting to me that anthropology perhaps has come full circle. That is to say, if you remember back to the very first issues that anthropologists were talking about, like kinship, and those Lewis Henry Morgan studies of kinship with both people and the non-human animals in the area, those old worn out texts, it seems like those issues of, again, kinship and community and indigenous people in our own society are the very thing that we're back to doing. Interestingly, though, in the olden days, people like Lewis Henry Morgan and Franz Boas and Margaret Mead and Ruth Benedict thought the indigenous people were about to go away. But maybe this time it's not the indigenous people. Maybe it's states and settlers who disappear, become different, or take houses out of the market entirely and they become part of collective ownership. This might be akin to these sorts of collective ownership approaches, which we believe dominated relationships in the Americas before settler colonialism, different approaches to private property. These are something that anthropology used to talk about a lot. Maybe we should come back to it. One of the questions, though, is what does that mean? Should we keep defending anthropology, or does anthropology itself also go away because it's fading out? I think what he's talking about is that there are a lot of people who want to defend the discipline just because it's there and because I have a job from it, a major or minor. And maybe that's not the best approach, but we can, in fact, think about the ways in which it could be used to repair the world. And that's why I mentioned that in some ways, I think that anthropology comes full circle. If TallBear is right, and she's an indigenous person who is also an anthropologist, then the idea of kinship needs to be, we can go back to even those jerks, even the Lewis Henry Morgan types, and maybe there was something that they have to say. This is what they gave me for the end. See the fireworks. Isn't it nice? Very nice. They gave me all this too. Look at all we did. Whoa. Whoa, so many sections. Can't believe it. It's hard for me to even believe. Look at this. This is what they gave me too. Look at that. Crazy. All those people. Can't believe it. Hard to imagine. Huh.